This episode is brought to you by the Mahonis Group. We build best-in-class iOS, Android, and web apps. We do this by integrating with teams that lack mobile expertise, and we work together to deliver creative mobile solutions that solve real business problems. To learn more about us and see our pricing, which is something we're very transparent about, visit jmg.mn. A small request before we get into this week's episode, and you'll learn more about it in this episode. We're trying something new with ratings and reviews. We know these asks are annoying, but they're very valuable to us. So, as a thank you for taking time to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, we will give you and or your company a shout out on a future episode. Leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, get free advertising. It's that simple. Even simpler, you can go to constantvariables.co/review and we will take you right there. Welcome to Constant Variables, a podcast where we take a non-technical look at building and growing digital products. I'm Tim Bornholdt. Let's get nerdy. Today we are chatting with Ryan Estes, founder of Kitcaster, a podcasting agency whose mission is to put the world's top startup founders on the world's top podcasts to help them share their stories with a wider audience. Ryan joins the show to talk about how entrepreneurs can use podcasting to grow their revenue, the traits of a good podcast host, how to increase listenership, and when you should and shouldn't host your own show. So, without further ado, here is my interview with Ryan Estes. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So, we got to jump right in with the $1 million question of how did you get into podcasting and what's your story? Like, how did you end up going from where you were to now finding Kitcaster?
Yeah, I got into podcasting a long time ago. I was originally introduced to podcasting through this expat Korean Zen monk named Henry Grevenberg. I found this guy on Twitter. At the time, I was kind of at war with all these Buddhists on Twitter. That's
ironic.
A story for another time. Yeah, there's no war like war with Buddhists. Trust me.
Yeah, no joke.
But I got to talking with him and kind of found a kindred spirit. And he released this series of essays called Field of Weeds, which was about him returning from Korea monastery and working construction. He'd take the bus to the job site. And they were brilliant. I'm sure they're still out there. Field of Weeds. Definitely check them out if you're interested in that kind of thing. Very esoteric and interesting. Anyway, he had published these as podcasts. And so I'd heard podcasts and whatever. I think this was probably, this might have been iPhone 1 era, iPhone 2 era, technologically, 12 years ago or whatever that was. So I started listening there and then kind of found this is when you would have to download podcasts to your phone or your iPod. So you'd kind of do your search on your laptop through iTunes, find podcasts, and then download it manually. And so, through kind of fiddling around looking for his podcast and downloading them, I was like, wow, there's podcasts on everything, and kind of discovered podcasting through that and just started downloading a bunch of stuff. And I found it to be early on this like amazing salve for my lonely soul. I had kind of a 2-hour commute each way and ripped through my music pretty quick, and then found myself really kind of attracted to podcasts, mostly because of its kind of, charming amateurism. There's a density to books on tape or to audiobooks that is like, man, I kind of want to, I like podcasts because you can kind of fade in, fade out. Not your listeners, of course. I'm sure they're very attentive.
They're all out.
They're totally out. It's just playing while they're asleep. So I kind of found podcasts that way and kind of it stuck.
I think you're right. Like I've never really thought of it that way, but having podcasting, the amateur side of things, be more approachable, maybe is the right word. Just whenever you listen to something, not to rag on NPR or Gimlet or any like very highly produced, talk program, where you really do have to pay attention and it's just kind of stressful sometimes. And it's almost like a chore. I think that the podcasts that I love the most are when it's just this, where it's just a couple of people talking about a topic topic that I'm interested in. And you're not always fully engaged. There's times where you can kind of weave in and out, but for the most part, you're kind of, as they talk about something, your mind maybe will wander to something on the similar topic, and then you get brought back into the conversation, and it's low pressure.
Absolutely. And it feels familiar. If people are just talking, it seems like you're in a group of people and there's a side conversation happening and you're eating the appetizers, listening to them. It's familial. Whereas like if you're talking about, like kind of journalism or, 60 Minutes or something and Leslie Stahl and, those are very unnatural ways to communicate. I mean, the talking sounds weird. There's always an agenda. There's some gotcha moments, but generally podcasting seems to be more endearing and like people are trying to meet in the middle, so I really like that. I do like the density of audiobooks. I love audiobooks and I like, even further density if you're talking about like religious scriptures and poetry and stuff like that. I like that too. But like for just kind of general consumption for your traffic jam, I found like finding comedy podcasts and music podcasts just to be great to kind of like space out to. So I guess it filled this like interesting hole of, kind of alleviating the drudgery of, stuff I had to do, whether it was traffic or it was folding laundry or doing the dishes. I didn't necessarily have to bring weight to it with something I really wanted to study. Rather, I could just kind of enjoy what was going on.
Oh, yeah. And how did having that experience with podcasting, how did that feed into going out and starting your own business within the world of podcasting?
You bet. So I did it so early, and around that time, I was launching what would become, Denver's first social media marketing agency. It's called Talk Launch. And I had kind of, came up building websites and doing MySpace campaigns for local music bands. I was a musician at the time, although it pains me to say was a musician. And at the time, folks were just kind of I was doing freelance stuff to help bands market and promote themselves online. This is probably about the time Instagram was born. Facebook had kind of basically shut down MySpace. And I was like, you know what? I think there's an opportunity here. This is before Facebook Business Manager and any advertising opportunities on any social media platforms. And so I started an agency that did just that. So at that time, I also started my first podcast, which was really a way for me to transition out of my career in music, if you could call it a career, successfully and kind of and work towards what I was going to do next. At the time I had 2 small children, and the music industry was not necessarily the fulcrum of commerce on a local level. So I had to make some new decisions. So I started this podcast, and that really helped me kind of get a footing on a new direction where I could hang out with my friends and talk trash and just have a good time, which kind of took the place of rehearsing music for me, socially, and then work on this agency. So that first podcast kind of gave way. I started another show called the Denver Business Podcast, where I interviewed founders of business and entrepreneurs locally, which I immediately found was a great Trojan horse to creating business for my marketing agency. And then, went on to produce, maybe a half a dozen different podcasts for different people, was always kind of active in podcasting in one way or the other for the last 12 years. 3 years ago, I was kind of having breakfast with a colleague, Brandy Whalen, our co-founder, and she had a PR agency, and she would send me her PR clients to be interviewed on the podcast. And she and I just clicked. We had a good friendly relationship, and she was kind of like, let's do something together. Let's do a project. I was like, okay, what do you want to do? And she's like, something in podcasting. So we kicked around a couple ideas, and out of that, this idea for a podcast booking agency was born. I think what kind of drew us to it is both of us come from kind of startup background. I had just come off a kind of a failed SaaS product, and was, looking for something new. So when we were thinking about this agency, it was really a matter of how do we scale a business like this? And it was really clear from the get-go that the way we do it is kind of, putting butts in seats, creating a business culture, and hiring people. Having a regular business it seemed a little bit novel coming from startup SaaS land. And so I think that appealed to both of us. So we kind of launched the company officially September 2019. And since then, we're about 2 years after that. And we got a team about, I think, 18 of us. And we're growing pretty well. So, podcasting has always been an absolute passion of mine. I love it. I'm an evangelist and pretty corny about it, tell you the honest truth. So I feel like I have the dream job. I have so much fun of learning from our founders and our clients, which are just dynamic and amazing, and also just being involved in podcasting in some capacity and give it back to that way.
I know a handful of different podcasting booking companies, kind of like yours, that go out and actually help people get on podcasts. But I think one thing that I've seen that kind of differentiates Kitcaster from others is not only do you get those appearances booked, but you can also measure conversions and make it so that you can. Podcasting is notoriously difficult to understand, any kind of analytics and metrics. So I'd love to hear you talk about how you're able to help people kind of quantify the value of being on podcasting.
Actually, I'm always trying to learn how that happens. I mean, one thing about podcasting is there is no central database for numbers. We can have some ballpark values of size of audience, for example. Maybe one misconception that folks have going on a podcast as a guest is you might think that the more audience that listen to it, the more conversions you'll have. And largely we found that to be false, So we spend a lot of time on the beginning to figure out what the outcomes of the campaign really are. Like, what do they want out of these podcasts? Everybody wants prospects for sure. But some folks want fundraising. A lot of people are using podcasting right now for recruiting. There's a great shortage of talent. People are looking at for personal branding, brand exposure. So we spend the time to really figure out what they want. And then we qualify the audience that's going to give them those conversions. And then we look for the podcast that has that audience. So depending on the client, it's totally variable of like what's best for them. Some clients, a really big audience, a broad reaching kind of common person audience is what's best for them. And we have programs for that. But a lot of times what it is we're looking for a very niche audience. And we really kind of go above and beyond to qualify the podcast to speak to that audience.
It's nice that you say that because there's so many ways to get your message out there. And I think people approach podcasting with kind of that blanket approach of trying to get on the biggest shows possible. And, to some extent, your Squarespaces and your other advertisers, it might make sense to have a campaign that you're on all the podcasts and you become known as the MailChimp of whatever. But I think as far as being a guest goes, no one really in this space has millions and millions of listeners. Like, I think most people that I know that have podcasts, if you average, even like getting 1,000 downloads in the first week of your episode, like you're doing pretty good. And even like if you have 1,000 people that are tuning in every week or every other week to hear your message, like, if you can get on a show where somebody has that kind of micro credibility and you have a product or a service that you want to reach those exact people, it's like that can be lightning in a bottle. That one single appearance could lead to lots of opportunity for you.
Absolutely. I guess I'm using war metaphors, but I would much rather have 300 Spartans than 1 million of the Persian army. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's like, if you're looking for conversions, niche podcasts of people that are providing solutions for their show, and that's the reason people are seeking them out, that's the place to go. Now, in our onboarding form, we say, what are some podcasts you'd like to go on aside from Rogan, Tim Ferriss, and How I Built This? We understand that everyone wants to go on those shows, but those shows don't take inbound leads for one, but also like those are entertainment shows. People are going to those shows to tune out of the solutions they need.
Right.
I want to hear stories about DMT and hunting too. So that's why I go to Rogan. But if I'm looking for a solution for a problem I have, then I'm going to go find a different podcast that's going to be offering up solutions consistently. And that's where you're going to get those conversions.
Oh, 100% agreed. With our podcast, we've always recorded remotely and virtually. So everything with the global pandemic and having to work from home has actually made it a lot easier for us to book guests, because it kind of forced people to become comfortable with like broadcasting from within their own houses. So I'm curious to hear from your perspective, how did the pandemic impact you at Kitcaster?
Oh man, you mean aside from sheer terror?
Yeah, just besides that.
So, okay. So, we launch September 2019. At the time, I was kind of validating different products, and my wife was largely running our agency, which, from 12 years ago, was still doing really well. And we were planning transitioning as she was changing careers, and I was going to move towards Kitcaster. So I kind of, bookmarked March 2020 as the time that I would convert, over to Kitcaster full time, which meant kind of shutting down the agency. But, February 2020 comes around. I'm like, man, this is some nice revenue from this agency that's kind of been operating for a long time. We had, great clients, that we'd had for many, many years. And so I was kind of like, maybe I can do both. But, COVID did solve that problem for us. We were at the time pretty heavily leveraged in food and beverage and hospitality with the agency. And so, we lost, I think, maybe a couple dozen clients in one day, So it's like, oh, well, I guess the agency is over. What's up with this Kitcaster thing? So both Brandy and I, she also was still working her PR firm, kind of turned our attention full time to Kitcaster and was like, hey, I think this is going to work, because for the reasons you just outlined, that like largely a lot of these podcasts are recorded remote. But also, our kind of ideal clients, which are SaaS founders, these are folks, particularly venture-backed SaaS founders. These are folks that have sales and marketing team. They've got fulfillment team. They got product team. If they're not sharing, a roof, what's really left for them to do, when everyone's at home and kind of working remote. And podcasting really became a thing that they could do to show leadership, to talk about how their company is adapting to the challenges, to find out how other companies are adapting to challenges. So we kind of had this suspicion that like podcasting is going to be a good bridge for them to get to wherever the heck we were going. And so, we kind of aggressively went after it and saw just kind of explosive growth. There was a market there where we thought it would be, which was very satisfying. And, kind of also, I think, provided on an emotional level a way for us to come to terms, just like talking to each other, like, are you okay? Where are you? You're in Toronto? What's it like there? Terrible? Yeah, it's bad here too. I mean, there was kind of a lot of nursing going on. I mean, I still remember my first Zoom call with a client where they're like literally in their jammies with their comforter pulled up to their chin. And, they're showing up to work like that. I was like, okay.
That's how we're rolling.
This is how we're going to do it. Okay. I'm good with this. So, so that's kind of, how that whole thing transpired, I suppose, all the way through whatever it was, July, when we made way for the, political upheaval and the massive protests all over Denver, which gave way, of course, to the massive upheaval and insanity of the election. So a weird time to have a young business, but
and you're talking to somebody that is from Minneapolis, so it's not like we had anything to do with any of that unrest or any of that. So
I've heard there was fires,
a couple.
Yeah. So yeah, it was pretty squirrely, and as it was for everybody. But I think that as a team, we came together. It became really important to us to be out in the open about some of these emotional things of like, everyone's got stress, anxiety, addictions, and depression going on. Like, how are we going to manage this? And largely, I think the team really pulled together and were able to deliver at a very high level.
It certainly seems like it. I mean, I think there's nothing like a shared tragedy or a shared stressor to bring a team together and give something to rally behind. Because I think that's what a lot of teams are striving for, is that kind of common goal and objective to get accomplished. So it's satisfying to hear that the pandemic, in a lot of ways, it's one of the, like, you always have to preface it with, we're obviously talking about a pandemic and social unrest and like some terrible things that are happening in our world. But at the same time, that's kind of the American dream in a lot of ways, is when you see injustice or when you see something that's not right, you have this entrepreneurial capability to jump together and band together and solve at least a problem in one way and kind of help push things back onto a track that you see as the right way to move forward.
100%. It's good to be in America. I'm waving the flag right now. It's pretty incredible, to be able to just move at the pace that we can move.
Agreed. We've talked a bit about the value for entrepreneurs being guests on podcasts. I'd like to shift a little bit about talking about the value of entrepreneurs having their own podcast. I know that you've mentioned your podcast, and it's actually ranked pretty consistently in the top 100 iTunes podcast list, which, to some people might seem like a vanity metric, but being ranked and the whole rate and review the show disclaimer that people have already heard once before when starting this episode, and they're going to hear again at the end, that stuff actually really does help drive listeners to your show. So I'm curious, if an entrepreneur has a show, what tips do you have for them from the perspective of getting more people in the door to listen to their podcast?
I think the one thing is I would just encourage them to not do it for that reason first. If you're chasing numbers, you're always going to be disappointed. And that's a terrible thing for your podcast. It's like you said, you got 1,000 listeners, man, that's amazing. But if you're looking at somebody else who's got 2,000, you're like, I wish I had that. That's just, you're kind of chasing your tail, So one, be happy with where you're at. Now, two, there's a lot of different ways that you can enhance the listenership for your show. The first one is to launch your show. If you didn't tell everybody that loves you that basically your relationship hinges on the fact that you get a rating or review for this podcast, then you didn't really launch the show. So there are some fantastic services and service providers that will help you do a launch. If you're a year and a half in, you're like, I never launched my show. Actually, I just started recording and told a couple people. There's still time, to launch the show or relaunch it, slap some new cover art on your podcast, call it a relaunch, but spend some time to do it. You might not find a lot of material looking for launching podcasts, but you'll find a ton of material on how to launch crowdfunding campaigns. And the idea is exactly the same. Which is to say, like, how many people are going to buy your product, or in this case, rate and review your show? You're like, I don't know, 200. But it's like, no. How many people will really do it? You're like, all right, 30, And so you work all your context for weeks building up to a pre-launch. If you've got a good email list, you build up that pre-launch anticipation, and then you get them to converge on one day and time where you get all of those ratings and reviews dropping on one particular thing. That's what triggers Apple Podcasts algorithm that puts you into the featured or the also heard as, or puts you in that top 10 ranking. And that's where you find, random people jumping on board for the podcast. So, definitely if you've got a podcast and you've come to terms and you're happy with your listenership, but you also want to grow, do some Google searching about how to launch crowdfunding campaigns, because it's exactly the same way you would relaunch your podcast.
Yeah, I think I've been doing my show now we're almost to 100 episodes now, and it
That's
feels
amazing.
like, yeah, thank you. I think so too. And I think like it's so hard. I think everyone's their own harshest critic, but I feel particularly harsh on myself. And I get done recording an episode and I'm like, oh man, I should have said this. I should have done that. I didn't do this. And then I go back and listen to an episode from a year ago and I'm like, I don't even remember like who's that guy that's hosting the show? Like the questions that came out, the content's actually like really good and valuable. And it's like, I think, I've always been of the mindset of, you can just go out and shake enough hands and you'll drum up enough attention. But, if you want to get critical mass, that whole system, knowing how to get, I don't want to say game the system, but just knowing how to optimize for the algorithm and dropping all those reviews all at the same time, or in the event of like Kickstarter, is to get everybody to donate money right on day one and have a huge start to it. Is like, in most crowdfunding campaigns, all the money either comes in on the first day or the last day. And so you like really need to make your money right out of the gate, or else you're going to just flounder in that kind of, you got a $10 bid here and a $10 bid there. It's like, if you get a rating and review here or there, that it's not like it's nothing. Obviously it's better than nothing, but yeah, if you can condense all of that into one concentrated attack, that's going to be the thing that pushes your needle and gets you into some of those lists that more people will find you organically.
That's so true. That's so true. And like, as much as you said vanity metrics, and unfortunately we're kind of vain people. That people will look and they're like, well, how many ratings and reviews does it have? It's like, well, I mean, it's in the top 20 categorically of its podcast. So what you have to do is just make sure that your ratings and reviews, it is important, unfortunately, is kind of also on point with the quality that you're putting out there. It's not the only important thing. But if you can get 30 people to really do it for you, it makes a gigantic difference.
What do you think about, other ways of increasing listenership? I think a common way is to keep going after bigger and bigger names with audience, like, people that have big audiences attached to them so they can promote your show to their people. Are there any other tricks and tips that you could deploy in order, if you already have a show and you've launched and you're in a decent position, but you want to continue to keep fueling the system? Are there any other kind of, secrets or things that you've seen that have worked successfully for others?
You bet. I mean, celebrities definitely do help. Celebrity guests are great, but obviously those are kind of difficult to secure. Celebrities are going to expect compensation for going on for interviews for sure. So will athletes. So I found people have success tangentially to celebrities, which would be maybe their spouse or partner, or dig up some IMDb about an actor who maybe doesn't have the accolades that they want. Show interest in people that are tangentially connected to people that cast a long shadow, and be interested in them and what they're doing, as opposed to their relationship to whatever star power there is. Again, it's kind of unfortunate that this vanity stuff is really what drives people. But it's like game the system a little bit. They listen to a couple of podcasts with you with a name or association to a name that they're comfortable with. And then they're like, I like this show. I like this host. I like what this person is doing. That's a good way to get people in the door, So as far as like, this kind of goes against my general principles of marketing, which would be kind of like starting at the bullseye and making a spiral outside. So crowdfunding is great with that, because you start with the people and and love that will definitely do it. And then you get them to do a rating and review. And then you ask those people to ask the people that they love on this specific date to give a rating and review, and those people, and so on. So you're moving from familiarity to like kind of strangers as you move out. Which is, again, part of just a launch strategy. But what you're past that, finding people tangential to celebrities and interviewing them with earnest and curiosity in what they're up to is a great way to kind of harness some of the star power that might draw kind of additional audiences.
Yeah, I think keeping your core audience in mind is helpful for that too. But for me, what's been at least helping move the needle from my front has been looking for people that I'm interested in. And I think a lot of times, we don't get approached with a whole lot of requests for people to have them come on our show. But like, I think a lot of times you can find the like, if you have a genuine interest in a guest and you reach out to them and they've, they're like there's everyone's a micro celebrity these days. Everyone's got like 1,000 followers on LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever. So it's, you can find people that have those kind of smaller audiences and just kind of work your way up to get bigger and bigger and bigger people. It's like, if you listen to Tim Ferriss's early podcast, it's not like he was immediately interviewing like Arnold Schwarzenegger and just big name people. It's like he started and kind of worked his way into it as well. You can do the same thing. Like don't try to go after getting Barack Obama on your podcast right out of the gate. It's probably not going to happen until you've like gone through a much more, much different. You basically have to go through the process and become the kind of level of podcaster where you can attract huge clients or huge interview guests like that.
Which would be Mark Maron. That was a benchmark day for podcasting when he interviewed Obama.
Yeah.
Or Tony Bourdain. He interviewed Obama. It's not impossible.
Absolutely not.
But yeah, no, I like what you were saying though, as opposed to going for like breadth of like people that have lots and lots of followers, like go for depth, which is if you are really into something, find somebody who's an expert on that. So you guys can take a really deep dive. Because people love hearing other people nerd out on stuff that they love too,
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing is the big thing, the big secret, the big trick with podcasting is you really have to know that it's it's an authentic game. Like people can sniff it out if you're being inauthentic, and if your podcast is just like welcome to entrepreneurs and like clearly it's just a big ad for whatever you're selling, it's people are going to tune out immediately. You gotta actually want to do this, and podcasting is not easy. I mean, you could probably speak to that of like how much prep work goes into talking to somebody, and how many interviews you have to have before you're comfortable with just meeting someone for the first time and jumping into a conversation with them.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of trust involved. Someone comes on your show and they're going to be a little bit nervous, and it really does become on the host to kind of comfort them and at least like guide them through a conversation well, which can be tough, especially if they're not giving you a lot to work with, one or two question or answers to questions. I definitely had that many a time. You ask someone a question, they're like, yes.
Well, that might be an interesting like topic of discussion too. I mean, you've been on a lot of podcasts, and just by the nature of your work, I'm sure you've interacted with all kinds of hosts and shows and stuff. Are there any like key indicators or key areas that you've seen like, oh yeah, this is going to be a good person like for my client to go on their podcast? Or like if you get someone that the other way around, like I want to start a podcast, are there like kind of key indicators where it's like, yeah, you'd be a really good podcast host versus maybe you should be a blogger?
Yeah, I think it's just people that talk. Us talkers, podcasts is just like our natural fit. Because we're gonna just deliver ear beatings to everyone we find anyway. So this gives us opportunity to do it well. And I think people that also just, I don't know, there's kind of a twinkle in your eye with some folks. That's a hard one to communicate to people asking for tips on how they can give their best performance. But really, it's like, hey, be playful. And I think those people are naturally drawn to podcasting. It might be an inherent trait though. I don't know if you can work on being playful in conversation, if that's an area that you can improve on. I'm sure it is. Yeah.
I mean, so my wife and I have been through the pandemic getting really into RuPaul's Drag Race. And
nice.
I mean, drag queens are like, it's just a whole phenomenal like industry of entertainment that I was not experienced with, besides just like, oh, it's a guy in a dress, but it's like so much more than that. And like when you've watched 13 seasons of the show and you see the progression of not only, the first season, people are wearing looks where it's like they're wearing jeans and a t-shirt, and it's like, come on, like versus now where it's like everyone who goes on has like immaculately designed dresses. And you look at the personalities of people in season 1 versus season 13, you've gotten like you can tell the kind of people that are make for good drag queens. And frankly, I think what I've experienced, which applies to podcasting, is, and you alluded to this too, is do they make you feel comfortable? I think I've listened to enough podcasts where you almost kind of go in with like, you want to listen to the content and you want to absorb what's going on, but you're just not confident that you're going to be carried along this path and feel comfortable with who's guiding you along that journey. And when I'm talking with people about them starting podcasts, it's like, I can tell right away if there's going to be like, if the person is going to make a good host is if I feel comfortable just in a normal conversation with them, that we can just, riff and just kind of bounce ideas off each other and let the conversation flow organically. And people that are really like type A, you have to stick to the script, you have to do it. It's like, maybe you can make an NPR style podcast, but the kind of podcast that we're talking about with like this interview kind of back and forth banter, you do really have to just be good at being relaxed and comfortable and being confident enough to carry someone on a journey to get their message out as well as get what you want out the door as well.
Yeah, totally. And do some prep work. I mean, there's some good journalistic questions that if you've been spacing out and you're in a pinch, you can always ask those, such as like, tell me more about that. If I ever asked that, that meant I was like thinking about my laundry or something and totally didn't hear what the person was saying,
Oh God. Yeah. Tell me more about that. No,
yeah. Or kind of what you were saying is like in the shower the next day, be like, dang, I didn't even cover the book that they were launching at all. I blew it. So I found, who was it? The 10% Happier podcast host. What's his name? Dan Harris. Dan Harris.
Oh, yeah.
Dan Harris has a great closing question, which is like, is there anything I should have asked you but didn't? And then if they're like, no, that's about it, you're like, I washed my hands of this. I did a good job.
Let the door open for you.
Yeah. So that's helpful. And part of the thing that we talk about with our clients, because we're really working on the guest side, is that, there's going to be times where great hosts have off interviews. And there's going to be times, everyone's trying to get better, but you're going to have podcast interviews that they got a great show, but they're not great at interviews. And so, be prepared to run the interview, so to speak, I mean, you're very talented at like having conversational style interviews, but not everybody is, so if you're kind of sitting on your heels, like waiting for people to lob you softball questions, man, you could have a really uncomfortable podcast, so kind of be ready. We do a little bit of preparation for folks. If it's an optional kind of service, but we call it story crafting, and we'll help people kind of tee up some of their best material. So in case it gets weird, they can go to where they're most comfortable.
Yeah. And it is like, I think, regardless of which way you approach this equation, whether you're a guest or whether you're a host, preparation is really important, and being able to, steer a conversation or know when it's time to pull the ripcord. I mean, I've had a couple of podcasts that we've recorded. I think there've only been a couple that we haven't actually aired. But those ones, it was like you could just tell it was a curiosity. I thought this person would make a good guest. And then for whatever reason, maybe I didn't eat breakfast that morning, or like something was off, and then the chemistry just isn't there. And it is a specific skill set that you have to foster with doing podcasting, where it's, I think with other kinds of marketing capabilities that you have with, again, blogging or social media or email marketing, podcasting really sets itself apart because you only have one sense that you're able to draw on for people. Like, you really have to be good at captivating someone's attention and be able to get a story across and paint that picture with words. And a lot of times you don't, with a blog, you can throw in a chart if you need to illustrate something, or you can make a video if you want to have, put that on top of podcasting, I guess. But you know what I'm saying? Like, you got to be able to have that. I guess I lost my train of thought, which is how it always happens on this show. Like I seem to start ranting, and then I start thinking about laundry. And what do you think of that?
No,
tell me more about that.
Which is being concise with your words. It's difficult, and it's a real skill to have. If you're a blogger, you throw that copy through Grammarly, you're like, dang, how come why can't I write? If you ever have your podcast interviews transcribed, it's very humbling. It's like, wow, I don't even speak in complete sentences. I'm just like you. Actually, everybody is. You ramble on. There's no commas or periods. There's maybe some dashes if you were to transcribe it. So learning to speak definitively and create pauses in kind of the way you talk is really important, and a very hard skill to do. And it also might come off kind of stodgy if you listen to it that way. I mean, there's something about conversation that is kind of a momentum thing, that people are used to, and all these filler words that I use that I'm conscious of suddenly, like, and like over and over again.
Mine's just stammering. I start doing that, and then you just start going down the road, and you're very aware of all of those things once you start listening back to yourself.
Oh, definitely don't think of it while you're saying it either. That's absolute complete disaster, which is kind of where we found ourselves now. But
no, that's okay. I mean, I think it's just like right now I'm stammering and trying to find my way back into a topic of conversation. And it is hard. It's really hard to be concise. And one thing I was going to say, you were talking about the transcription thing. Oh man, that's like that. And people, when they first, I think the two biggest rookie mistakes is looking back at your transcription the first time and seeing how many times the transcription engine just freaks out and stops because you stammered on and made no sense. And it's just one incredibly long sentence. But then the other one is going the opposite route and going in and taking out every and and making it sound so clean and robotic. It doesn't sound natural. And again, it's the whole authenticity piece. You have to be comfortable with your flaws, however they are, and you get better as time goes on, and you learn how not to stammer and not to use those fallback filler words. But it's a big process, and that's one thing I would advise if you're getting into podcasting to keep in mind is it's really a new craft you have to hone. It's not as easy as just picking up a mic and going. It kind of is, but if you want to be good at it, you have to put in the work.
No, 100%. And also, I think that there's something beautiful about stammering, because I do it. And it's trying to find common ground with who you're talking to, especially if they're a stranger. You don't necessarily know if they're going to agree or disagree with you. If you're making definitive statements and speaking concisely, then you're basically creating a hill that maybe you might have to die on. You don't know how much that person you're talking to is opposed to that. So, you could say, you know what, I really like the color red. And like, maybe you should stick to that. But most people would be like, but I mean, I like blue and purple's good. If you like black, if you don't like red, that's cool. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that you don't like red. I'm just saying that sometimes I don't even know if I like red.
Oh yeah, no one wants to listen to that.
Everybody's hedging all the time, but it comes from like an endearing place, and something that's very like beautiful about podcasting, I think, is that its essence is to like join people on common ground. So with all that hedging and like not creating definitive statements, what you're saying to the person is like, hey, this is who I am, but I'm also totally cool with you are, if you happen to be the kind of person who's like that. And if you're not, that's cool too, because I think everything is okay. Not that I think everything is okay, but so that I think everything pretty much is all right. So we'll keep stammering like that on and on and on and on, which can work. For people, again, if they're thinking about doing a podcast, do not be the podcast that edits out all the ums and uhs. That'll kill you.
Yes.
Rather, what you do is you record a preliminary interview, and then you record another interview, and you let them know the agenda, what they're going to speak to, and what they said before, and make sure that they know what they said so that they're confident in it. And then you ask them to walk through the interview slowly, speaking 15% slower than they normally would. And then you get all of the really confident, definitive statements that you can cut out and edit to oblivion.
Oh, that's beautifully said. That's the worst part of this job, I think, is pulling out those pull quotes of finding something for social media that is clear and concise and makes a lot of sense. Because a lot of times you do get the rambling and you have to kind of, you read the transcript and it is a lot of dashes where people are quantifying what they're saying or hedging what they're saying. And yeah, it's a lot easier said than done. And also talking slowly is not something that I feel like I don't talk very fast, but then you get excited. And that's the thing with me and podcasting. I get so excited interviewing people and getting to know about people. And it's just so easy to get off on a tangent and start rambling and going super fast. And then whoever's listening to this on 1.75x all of a sudden is just completely lost and has to rewind to hear what I had said again.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. But I like that energy, I do like the calm energy too. If you're listening to NPR, but it also seems like NPR is trying to like hypnotize you with their voice. Or you listen to Sam Harris, he's definitely trying to hypnotize. He's doing some kind of witchcraft with his voice.
Yes.
But I love that. I admire people that are virtuistic with their voice, and speaking intentionally slow and clear is very difficult, so people that go that route, I hats off to them. I like your style a little bit better. It's a little more bebop, you know what I mean? It's a little more up and down. Like let's get this energy moving through the conversation.
Right. I mean,
and it works
people
too,
I mean, for my philosophies, people are giving me an hour of their time when they listen to this podcast, and I want it to be, if they got nothing out of it, at least it was entertaining and I looked like a buffoon and they got some smiles out of it. That's fine by me.
Yeah, totally. No, I agree.
One last kind of, probably should have led with this topic actually, now that I'm thinking through this, but that's okay. That's what happens when you just jump around without really looking at your script. I think a lot of times we've been talking about podcasting, the power of podcasting for your business. And, I'm doing this myself. I get to make really meaningful connections with people. I get an hour of uninterrupted time with people, which is insane to ask for in this kind of environment that we're living in. But I'm really curious to hear from your perspective. What are some of the biggest reasons that people should start their shows? And then on the flip side, when do you talk people out of starting their own shows?
Ooh, that's a good question. Maybe I'll start with that one. I would talk everybody into starting their own shows. I would also give them the advice not to judge the show until the 100th episode. And you, my friend, are getting dangerously close to that judgment.
Oh, I am so excited to judge this show. You have no idea.
I think everybody should start with their friends. There's something magical that happens when you hit record, especially if you have headphones on. You're the friend you're talking to, maybe across the table or maybe on a Zoom call. Suddenly their voice is in the middle of your brain. And there's no distractions. They're not looking at their phone halfway through your conversation. They're forced to respond to you in time, because if you both care about making a good episode, then your attention is there. And that's a very scarce resource, obviously, attention, especially the ones of the people that you love the most. Those are the people that you tend to take advantage of the most, not in a negative way, but generally like you can kind of trail off and go look at your phone in the middle of the conversation. So, interview your friends, talk about something, figure it out, record 5 episodes right to the voice memo app in your phone. There's a big thing that happens with creative people, which is they kind of get addicted to the idea and they're addicted to thinking of the idea. And someone might chew on making a podcast for 6 weeks, and they're going to spend a couple $1,000s on equipment, and they're going to get the website and this and that, and the logo will look like this. That's all just spinning your wheels. Find 5 people that you can talk to and record a conversation with them. If the conversation is good, it's not going to matter the fidelity of the recording. You can publish that and launch your podcast. Just get it done. If you're the kind of person that can't do that and you really just want to fall in love with the idea, again, maybe I was going to say that you shouldn't do it, but I don't ever want to be a discouraging force for podcasting. I think you should go ahead and do it. I think you'll just end up with a lot of dusty podcast equipment.
I think that's reasonable. It is something with podcasting. The advice I frequently hear is give yourself like a 10 episode trial, like just commit to a number that you say, I'm going to do 10 episodes or 15 or 5, whatever it is, but just commit to a number and see how much you've improved from episode 1 to episode X, and then make the decision. Kind of like you said, you can't judge until you've done this 100 times. I remember starting my podcast, we went the route of doing 10 like evergreen episodes that were just me and my business partner. And we were just talking into a microphone, and I thought it was a blast because I've always wanted to have my own radio show anyway. So having a podcast is like a cheap way of getting into that, fulfilling that childhood dream of mine. And then,
Totally.
We started interviewing guests, and it was started with just people we knew. And there is something magic about getting to like let somebody else shine for a little bit and help shine somebody else up so you can help them promote what they're doing and hear their story. Because I guarantee when you bring, especially in a business context, if you have a client that you bring onto your podcast and you start asking them their story and you start asking them other things, you will learn something new about these people that you've been working with for years. And every time I bring on a client, it's like my favorite time because I get to rebuild that relationship that I got to build with them early on in this whole process of building software. So, Yeah, I really like that advice of start with bringing on your friends and just hit record and see what happens. I bet you'll actually really get a kick out of it.
Absolutely. Start with a bottle of wine. Make it a little sloppy the first couple episodes. Figure out the beats you want to hit. Ask them about that $100 they owe you. That you haven't talked about in a couple years.
Oh yeah, get right out of the gate with the gotcha journalism. That's exactly how you have a good podcast.
That's how it goes. Yeah. No, I think everyone should try it, and the folks that it sticks with, it'll serve you well.
I agree. So last question, because we can't talk about podcasts without talking about podcasts. We're already meta as it is, so we need to go meta. What are some of your favorite podcasts? What are you listening to these days?
Oh, that's a great question. I have been really enjoying music podcasts again. I really like Talib Kweli's podcast. That's a great one. I love Questlove's podcasts. He's got a great show. I've been listening to Hooked on Pop again. That's a good one. And then, of course, Song Exploder, which is probably the definitive podcast in the genre. That's a good one, too. But I've been really enjoying kind of music podcasts. And also, not the champs, the drink champs. Every once in a while, I'll put the drink champs on because listening to grown men just get totally hammered is kind of entertaining, turns out. I kind of like that. So I've been listening to a lot of 90s rap artists podcasts.
Nice. This might be embarrassing. I'm going to do it too. Can you pull out your phone and tell me, like, in your podcast client right now, what episode or what podcast is if you were to hit play would be playing right now?
Okay. It's The Healing Power of Pop by Switched on Pop. I don't know if you're familiar with that podcast, but it's like
No, I'm not.
It's a ethnomusicologist and a songwriter that interview different folks. Usually they're doing kind of dismantling pop songs, whatever like glossy pop songs is hot at the moment, which is really interesting to hear their takes. This particular episode is about like anxiety and depression and its kind of prevalence in pop culture lyrics right now, particularly like kind of like the very say they're not making metaphors. They're like, I'm taking medication for depression. And that's like the first verse. So that's what this episode was about. It was pretty good. It was all right.
Jeez. I wrote it down. I'm going to have to look into it. What's your podcast player of choice?
I use Apple.
Right.
I use Apple Podcasts. Yeah. I've done everything else, but I just end up back there for whatever reason, even though they kind of disrespect podcasting kind of, but
that's how it goes. I'm an Overcast man myself. I just pulled out my phone because I figured fair is fair. So the episode I was listening to is from The Office Deep Dive, which is hosted by I don't know if you ever watched The Office, but it's the guy who played Kevin Malone on The Office. He does
the HR guy.
Yeah. No, the accountant,
Kevin, the ball guy.
Yep. Yeah. He did a quick series with Spotify, I think it was, and then spun out his own show after doing that thing. And he brings on like producers and all this stuff. And so I'm listening to an episode with him and Ellie Kemper, and she played the receptionist Erin, who is like in the later seasons. And it's hilarious. And it's so like, I feel like a bad podcast consumer, because you feel like you should be consuming like business podcasts and self-help and getting better and stuff. But lately I've been so stressed out and overwhelmed with life that just listening to junk food podcasts, like I listen to like Stone Cold Steve Austin's podcast, and I listen to the guys who created Workaholics. Their podcast is phenomenal. And it's literally just four dudes sitting around like cussing each other out, and they have a soundboard, and it's just ridiculous. So, sometimes you need the junk food podcast. Exactly.
Yeah, you got to put in Bill Burr twice a week while he rants at the entire world, because it makes you feel better.
Oh yeah, exactly. Ryan, is there anything? I'm going to steal this question. Is there anything that I should have asked you that I didn't?
And then I let you off the hook, and I'm like, no, you know what? That was great.
I love it. How can people get in touch with you and learn more about what you're doing with Kitcaster?
You bet. Best place is kitcaster.com, kitcaster.com. If you're interested in being on podcasts. That's all we do is we book people on podcasts. Largely, we work with startup founders, funded startup founders, entrepreneurs with exits, and C-suite execs. But there's a bunch of resources and information there at the website, and you can definitely get a hold of me there if you'd like.
I love it. Thank you so much for coming on the show today and talking about podcasting. I think I again, Hunch is saying that there's going to be some really great content in here. Who knows? It could just have been an hour of incoherent rambling, but I at least got a lot out of it. So I'm hoping that everybody else did as well. And thank you so much for joining me.
I got a lot out of it too. Thanks so much, Tim.
Thanks to Ryan Estes for joining me on today's podcast. You can learn more about Kitcaster at kitcaster.com. Show notes for this episode can be found at constantvariables.co. You can get in touch with us by emailing hello@constantvariables.co. I'm at Tim Bornholdt on Twitter, and the show is at CV_podcast. Today's episode was produced by Jenny Karkowski and edited by the razor-sharp Jordan Doust. As I mentioned at the start of the episode, if you could take 2 minutes to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, we'll give you a mention in a future episode as a thank you. Visit constantvariables.co/review and we will take you right there. This episode was brought to you by the Jed Mahonis Group. If your team needs mobile expertise, we'd love to work with you. Give us a shout at jmg.mn.